In the heart of a small, quiet village nestled between towering mountains, an elderly bartender named Old Thom runs the local tavern. A man of few words, Thom serves his patrons with a steady hand and calm demeanor, keeping to himself and avoiding trouble. But when a group of outlaws, notorious for their ruthless behavior and mocking nature, come into the tavern one fateful night, they unwittingly challenge something far greater than they realize. Thom, though appearing frail and harmless, was once the king's most feared swordsman, a member of the king's guard. An experience he thought he'd left behind long ago. As the night unfolds, the outlaws will learn, too late, that the man they taunted is no mere bartender. Their mockery will awaken a force that not even they could have anticipated. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. Old Thom had seen many things in his life, though now, as he wiped down the worn wooden counter of the tavern, it was mostly the same faces that came and went through the door. He was well into his 70s, his hair thin and gray, his back hunched from years of labor. The once strong hands that had held swords and shields now held mugs of ale, his fingers calloused not from the grip of battle but from the rough, everyday work of pouring drinks and mopping floors. The tavern, the Shining Chalice, was the heart of the village, tucked away at the edge of a mountain pass. Travelers passed through on occasion, but most who entered were locals, farmers, tradesmen, and the occasional merchant. It was a peaceful place, free from the chaos of the larger cities. A place where people came to escape the troubles of the world, where they could drink, eat, and laugh away their worries. But that night, the calm would be shattered. Old Thom was setting a new mug on the counter, his hands steady despite the years. The door swung open with a creak, and in walked a group of men, loud, brash, and far too full of themselves. The leader of the group was a man with a thick, black beard that covered most of his face, except for his eyes, which gleamed with the kind of arrogance only outlaws could possess. His companions, equally rough and crude, crowded into the tavern, taking seats at a nearby table with a series of slaps and laughs. Thom didn't look up immediately. He had seen their type before. Rogues. Thieves. The kind who thought themselves untouchable. They'd been running rampant across the kingdom, causing trouble wherever they went. But Thom had learned long ago to keep his head down, to avoid conflict. His years as a member of the king's guard were behind him now, forgotten by most, including himself. He had chosen a quiet life, a life where he no longer needed to unsheath his sword or prove his skill. But the moment the men began to speak, Thom's hand tightened on the mug he was holding. "Look at this place," the leader sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A rat's nest in the middle of nowhere. What kind of a tavern is this?" The other men laughed, their voices booming across the room. Thom didn't flinch. He finished wiping the counter, his back still to them. He was used to the mockery. It had come from all sorts of people over the years. His quiet, unassuming nature invited it. But tonight, something in the way the leader spoke stirred a memory inside him, one of old battlefields and royal halls. "I suppose you'll take what I can give you," Thom said, his voice calm, almost too calm. He turned, setting the cloth down. The men stopped laughing for a brief moment, looking at him with a kind of curiosity. "You're the one who runs this joint?" The leader's voice was mocking now, as if amused by the elderly man's presence. He raised an eyebrow. "You don't look like much. What are you? Some old fool who's too scared to swing a blade anymore?" Thom's gaze shifted slowly from the mugs on the shelf to the leader's face. His eyes, though aged and tired, were sharp, glinting in the dim candlelight. There was a subtle shift in the air, something palpable in the room. He hadn't drawn a sword in years, but the tension that now hung between him and the man before him made something stir within him. Something ancient, something long buried. The leader chuckled, taking a swig from his own mug, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrent of danger that had crept into the air. "You know, old man, if you weren't so frail, I'd almost think you were, well, useful for something." He leaned back in his chair, his legs spread wide, and he surveyed Thom as if he were an object to be evaluated. Thom took a slow step forward, the worn wooden floor creaking beneath him. His hand rested lightly on the edge of the counter, but for a split second, it looked like the weight of his years had vanished. The flicker of something deep within him, the warrior who had once stood at the king's side, began to rise. "I may be old," Thom said, his voice steady, "but I've seen more battles than you'll ever know." The leader's grin faltered, but only for a moment. "Is that so, old man? And where exactly did you fight, then? In the kitchen?" The outlaws laughed again, but this time, there was a slight edge to the laughter, as though they were beginning to sense something shifting. They were far from the man who had been their target, Old Thom, the quiet bartender. This was something different, but the leader, arrogant as ever, wasn't ready to admit that yet. "You should be careful with your words," Thom said, stepping closer, his voice dropping low. "Some words carry weight." For a moment, the tavern seemed to fall silent, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The men looked at one another, exchanging glances. The leader, though clearly caught off guard, scoffed. "You're all talk, old man. What's a bartender going to do? Serve us drinks and run away when the trouble starts?" Thom's eyes narrowed. "I don't run." There was a finality to his words that caused a shift in the air, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The outlaws may have been bold, but they were far from wise. They had just made their last mistake. The leader of the outlaws sneered, his face contorting in amusement as he leaned back in his chair. "You've got spirit, old man, but I'm afraid that spirit won't save you when I break your legs and drag you out of here." The other outlaws chuckled, their voices thick with mockery, their attention still on Thom. It was clear they thought him harmless, an old man who had seen his better days, no more than a frail servant behind the bar. But what they didn't realize was that Thom was no ordinary tavern keeper. They had underestimated him, and in that moment, they had already sealed their fate. Thom didn't flinch. His hands, though gnarled with age, remained steady at his sides. He could feel the weight of the sword beneath his tunic, the one that had once served him so well in battles that had shaped the very kingdom they mocked. It had been years since he'd drawn it, years since he'd felt the thrill of combat, but that part of him, the part that had once been a king's guard, never fully disappeared. The leader's voice was laced with arrogance as he continued. "I don't think you're in a position to be making threats, old man. Why don't you pour us another drink before I make you regret talking so much?" But Thom didn't move. Instead, he locked eyes with the man, his voice quiet but carrying a weight of authority that was unmistakable. "You should leave now, before you make another mistake." The tavern was still, the usual hum of conversation gone, replaced by a heavy silence. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, but everything else seemed to freeze. The outlaws were no longer laughing. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Thom and the leader, sensing the shift in the air. But the leader, ever the fool, refused to back down. He stood up slowly, his boots scraping against the floor, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man. I'll show you what happens when you disrespect me." As he spoke, the other outlaws began to rise as well, their hands drifting to their weapons. But Thom had seen this before. He knew exactly what would happen next. The leader made his move first, his hand drawing the sword in a fluid, practiced motion. He swung it high, aiming for Thom's shoulder, clearly expecting an easy strike. But Thom, his eyes narrowing with precision, stepped aside effortlessly, his body moving like a shadow, his instincts sharp despite his age. The leader's sword passed through the air where Thom had been just moments before. Before the leader could recover, Thom's hand shot out, grabbing a nearby mug of ale. He tossed it into the leader's face with a speed that defied his appearance, the liquid splashing across the man's eyes. The leader howled in surprise, stumbling back, his sword hand shaking as he tried to wipe the liquid from his face. That was all the time Thom needed. In one swift movement, Thom drew the sword hidden beneath his tunic. The blade, gleaming in the firelight, caught the eye of every man in the room. The outlaws froze. The very air seemed to shift. Thom stood tall now, his back straight, his stance confident. He wasn't the frail old man they had thought him to be. He was a king's guard, a warrior who had stood in battle for years. The leader stumbled back, his face a mix of rage and disbelief. "What the hell are you?" he spat, his voice trembling. Tom's expression was cold, his eyes hard with years of experience. "I am the man you just made your last mistake with." Without warning, Tom moved again, faster than the leader could react. His sword flashed, a blur of steel cutting through the air. The leader barely had time to raise his sword in defense before Tom's blade met it, the sound of metal clashing ringing through the tavern like a thunderclap. The leader grunted, his legs buckling beneath him as Tom's blade pushed him back. Tom didn't give him a moment to recover. In one fluid motion, Tom brought his sword down in a wide arc, forcing the leader to stagger backward. The other outlaws, stunned by the speed and precision of Tom's attack, hesitated, unsure of what to do next. "Leave," Tom commanded, his voice a low growl. But the outlaws, now realizing the true nature of the man they had mocked, hesitated, fear creeping into their expressions. The leader, still reeling from the blow, looked up at Tom, his defiance faltering. "You're just an old fool," the leader spat, his voice filled with venom and disbelief. "You think you can take us all on? We're a dozen strong, and you're just one man." Tom's eyes glinted. "And you are a dozen fools who should have walked out the door when you had the chance." With those words, Tom moved again, this time faster than the eye could follow. His sword was a flash of silver in the dim light, a blur of lethal precision. He struck once, twice, each blow precise, calculated, and devastating. The outlaws didn't even have time to draw their weapons before they were disarmed or knocked to the floor, defeated by Tom's swift and unrelenting attacks. The tavern, which had once been filled with laughter and drunken chatter, was now filled with the sound of heavy breathing, the clatter of falling weapons, and the groans of defeated men. Tom stood over them, his breathing steady, his grip still tight on the sword. The leader, now kneeling on the ground, looked up at Tom, his eyes wide with fear. Who are you?" the leader stammered, his voice breaking. Tom's eyes softened just a fraction. "I was once the king's guard," he said quietly, his voice cold but calm. "A man who fought to protect the kingdom. And now I'm a bartender in a quiet village. But never forget, I am still the same man." The outlaws remained on the floor, some too stunned to move, others nursing wounds too painful to ignore. Tom stepped over them, his gaze hardening as he approached the door. "You'll leave now," Tom said, his voice firm, "or I'll show you what it means to cross the king's guard." The outlaws, now thoroughly humbled and terrified, scrambled to their feet. Without another word, they fled the tavern, running out the door as quickly as they had entered, leaving behind a silence that was almost as deafening as their laughter had been just moments before. Tom stood in the center of the tavern, his sword still raised, his chest heaving with the exertion of the fight. His body ached, but he knew that the danger had passed. The outlaws would not return. For a moment, Tom allowed himself a breath, a brief moment of peace. But in that silence, a deep sadness lingered in his heart. He had hoped never to draw his sword again. But sometimes, fate had other plans. The tavern was still. The last echoes of battle faded, leaving behind only the quiet crackle of the fire in the hearth. Tom's hand trembled slightly as he wiped the blood from his sword, the blade gleaming in the low light. His old muscles protested, sore from the years of disuse, but his mind was sharp, clear. He had faced many battles in his life, but this fight was different. It had been years since he had drawn his sword, but the years hadn't dulled his instincts. They had only refined them. The silence stretched, and Tom let the weight of the moment settle over him. He wasn't just a bartender. He wasn't just the old man they'd mocked. In that brief, brutal exchange, he had been the man who had stood at the king's side, the man who had fought to protect the kingdom from those who sought to tear it apart. But the moment passed, and the reality of the world he had left behind came rushing back. He was not that man anymore. He had chosen to live a quiet life. He had hoped the past would remain where it belonged, in the past. Tom sheathed his sword, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of its scabbard. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of who he had once been. It wasn't the first time he had felt it. The call to battle, the call to fight. It had always been there, lying dormant, but now it was awake again. And though he didn't want to admit it, Thom knew that this fight, this act of defense, had been inevitable. The door creaked open, and Thom turned, startled from his thoughts. The figure who entered was a familiar one. Roderick, the young man who had been a regular at the tavern. Roderick had known Thom before he became the quiet bartender. He had known the man who had once been feared across the kingdom, the man who had carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Roderick's eyes flicked over the scene, taking in the overturned chairs, the wreckage from the fight, and the defeated outlaws still lying on the floor. His eyes met Thom's, and for a brief moment, the weight of what had just happened passed between them. "You did it," Roderick said, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. Thom nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the men who had dared to mock him. "They didn't know who they were dealing with," he said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't want to fight them, Roderick, but they didn't leave me much choice." Roderick's face softened, and he took a step closer to Thom. "I know, but still, you showed them something tonight. Not just who you were, but who you still are." Thom sighed deeply, running a hand through his thinning hair. "That man is gone," he said quietly. "I left that life behind long ago. I chose peace. But sometimes, peace isn't enough." Roderick stood beside him now, his face filled with understanding. He had known Thom long enough to understand the weight of his words. He knew that Thom had given up more than just a life of battle. He had given up the honor, the glory, and the purpose that had come with it. He had chosen a life of quiet anonymity. But tonight, the echoes of the past had dragged him back into the fight. "You can't hide who you are, Thom," Roderick said softly. "That's something you taught me a long time ago. You can run, but you can't escape your own nature." Thom looked at Roderick, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and regret. "I didn't want to be that man anymore. I wanted to be someone else, someone who could leave all of that behind. But when I drew that sword tonight, I realized that man never really left. He was just waiting for the right moment to return." Roderick didn't say anything in response. He knew better than to argue. Instead, he simply placed a hand on Thom's shoulder, offering the older man a gesture of support. "Maybe it's not about being that man again. Maybe it's about using what you've learned, everything you've been through, to make a difference. You don't have to go back to what you were, Thom. You're still the man who protected the kingdom, and there's still work to be done." Thom's eyes flicked toward the door. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him again. The outlaws had learned something valuable tonight. They had learned that the kingdom's old guard wasn't as gone as they thought. But more than that, Thom had learned something about himself, that despite his years of solitude, the call to protect had never truly left him. "I don't know what comes next, Roderick," Thom said, his voice quieter now. "But I can't run from who I am. Not anymore." Roderick nodded. "Then let's face it together. The kingdom may be broken, but there's still hope. You've shown us that." Thom felt a flicker of something inside him, a spark that had been extinguished long ago. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, and Thom knew, deep down, that he couldn't walk away from it now. There was still too much at stake. As Roderick left the tavern to tend to the wounded, Thom stood alone, looking around the familiar space. The room was quieter now, the weight of the battle lifting from the air. But in that silence, Thom could hear the echo of his past, a past that was calling him once more. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The kingdom needed him again, and he would rise to answer that call, even if it meant facing the ghosts of his past. The next morning, the village of Shining Chalice was quiet, as it always was after the storm had passed. The outlaws had been scattered, fleeing into the hills, nursing their wounds and nursing their pride. Thom had expected them to return, but there was no sign of them yet. And yet, the silence felt heavier than usual. There was an unease in the air, a knowledge that things had changed, irreparably so. Thom had gone about his duties as usual, though now, every time the door creaked open, his heart beat a little faster, his eyes a little sharper. He wasn't just an old bartender anymore. Not after last night. He was still the man who had once stood beside kings and fought in the bloodiest of battles. That man was no longer hidden behind the soft wrinkles and the slow gait of age. He had returned, though Thom wished he had stayed buried forever. He had seen how quickly the men had turned to fear last night. Their bravado, their mockery, had faltered as soon as they realized who they were dealing with. But the fear had not been from Thom's blade alone. It had been the recognition of something much older, something forgotten by time. The outlaws had underestimated the man standing before them. But, in truth, Thom had underestimated the weight of the past. As he prepared the tavern for another day, a loud knock echoed from the door. Thom paused, his hand lingering on the counter. He knew who it was before he even opened it. Roderick stood there, his face grim, the usual fire in his eyes now replaced with concern. Behind him stood a group of men and women, travelers, their faces haggard from the journey, their eyes wary. Roderick's gaze never left Thom's face as he spoke. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Thom stepped aside, letting the group in. They filed into the tavern, some taking seats at the long wooden tables, others standing, their posture tense. Thom wiped his hands on his apron and nodded for Roderick to speak. The young man stepped forward, his voice low. "I've heard rumors," he began, his eyes darting to the group around them. "Not just from the outlaws, but from the larger towns. Word is spreading that the King's Guard, the old guard, has risen again. They think you're a legend, Thom." Thom raised an eyebrow. "A legend?" he muttered under his breath. His thoughts flickered back to the days of old, when he had fought in the king's name, when he had stood as a symbol of power and strength. But those days were gone. The king was no longer on the throne. The kingdom was fractured, its people divided. "They're looking for you," Roderick continued, urgency creeping into his voice. "The rebels. They think you can rally the loyalists. And they're not the only ones. There are others, forces you don't know about, who are ready to back you. If you make the call, they'll come. They'll fight with you." Thom felt a knot twist in his stomach. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted it. The kingdom, the rebellion, the politics, they were all part of a life he had chosen to leave behind. But now, it seemed the past had a way of dragging you back into the fray, whether you liked it or not. "They think I'm still the man I was," Thom said softly, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "The man who fought for the king. The man who led men into battle. But that man is gone, Roderick. I left that behind." Roderick's voice grew more insistent. "You can't leave it behind, Thom. The kingdom needs someone who knows what it means to fight. It needs someone who understands what's at stake. And whether you want to admit it or not, that someone is you." Thom's hand gripped the edge of the counter. "I'm just a bartender," he muttered. "I pour drinks. I serve people who come in off the road, tired and weary. I'm not the man I used to be." Roderick stepped forward, his voice lower now, filled with quiet intensity. "You were never just a bartender, Thom. You were always more. And whether you want to face it or not, the kingdom needs you. It's falling apart. The rebellion is growing stronger. And if we don't unite the loyalists soon, if we don't take a stand now, it'll be too late." Thom closed his eyes, the weight of Roderick's words sinking in. He could feel it, the pull of his past, the duty that had never truly left him, no matter how hard he had tried to bury it. The old man who had fought for the king, who had defended the kingdom with his sword, had never really disappeared. He had simply hidden, waiting for the right moment. And now, that moment was here. Thom sighed, his shoulders sagging. "What do you need me to do?" Roderick's face lit up, the relief evident in his eyes. "We need to gather the loyalists. There are towns to the north, loyal to the old king. If we unite them, we can make a stand. But we need a leader, someone who can inspire them, someone they'll listen to." Thom looked at the group gathered in the tavern, their eyes expectant, their hopes pinned on him. He knew they were right. He had been a king's guard. He had led armies. He had once been a man who inspired men to fight, to die, for a cause. And now, he was being asked to do it again. Not for a king, but for the kingdom itself. "I can't promise you victory," Thom said, his voice steady now, a quiet resolve settling over him. "But I'll do what I can. For the kingdom. For the people. The room seemed to exhale, the tension lifting slightly. Roderick smiled, his eyes filled with a fierce optimism. That's all we need, Thom. You're not alone in this. Thom looked at him, then at the faces of the travelers and loyalists around him. They were scared, uncertain, but they were ready to follow him. And as much as he had tried to avoid it, Thom realized that he had no choice but to lead them. The rebellion wasn't just a battle for power. It was a fight for the soul of the kingdom. And Thom was the only one who could remind them what they had once fought for. I'll need you to gather the others, Thom said, his voice commanding now. Send word to the north, and get the people ready. We move at first light. Roderick nodded eagerly, his determination matching Thom's. We'll be ready. As Thom turned to face the doorway, his hand resting once more on the hilt of his sword, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing. The quiet life he had built, the peace he had worked so hard to create, was slipping away. The old man, the swordsman, the protector of the kingdom. He was waking up again. And this time, he wouldn't rest until the kingdom was free. The morning was still shrouded in mist when Thom and the small group of loyalists set out from Shining Chalice. The tavern, once bustling with life and laughter, now stood silent behind them. The weight of the decision hung heavily on Thom's shoulders, and he could feel the stirrings of the old warrior within him. The man who had once fought at the king's side, who had led soldiers into battle. But that was a lifetime ago. Or so he had thought. The road to the north was long and treacherous, winding through dense forests and along jagged cliffs. They traveled in silence for most of the day, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the forest floor, the occasional snap of twigs breaking underfoot. Thom led the group, his senses alert, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Though he hadn't been in battle for years, the instincts were still there. The careful awareness of his surroundings, the ever-present feeling that danger was always just around the corner. Roderick walked beside him, his face set in determination but tinged with concern. Are you sure about this, Thom? He asked, his voice low, as if he didn't want to break the stillness of the forest. You didn't have to do this. You could have stayed in the village, stayed out of it all. Thom's gaze flicked to the younger man, his eyes hardening for just a moment. It's too late for that, Thom replied, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet resignation. The kingdom needs something more than peace now. It needs strength. And whether I want to admit it or not, that strength has to come from me. Roderick nodded, accepting Thom's words without argument. He had seen the way Thom fought last night. He had seen the power in the old man's movements, the precision, the deadly grace that came with years of experience. And though Thom had tried to bury that part of himself, Roderick knew it was still there, lying dormant, waiting to be called upon when the time came. The group moved in small, tight formation, their horses steady under them as they navigated the rugged terrain. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and earth. It was a peaceful, quiet morning, and for a brief moment, Thom allowed himself to settle into the calm of it. But peace was a fleeting thing in times like these, and Thom knew that the journey ahead would not be an easy one. By midday, they reached a small clearing in the woods, and Thom ordered the group to stop. They needed to rest, to stretch their legs, and to discuss their next move. Thom dismounted from his horse, his stiff joints protesting with each movement. He glanced at the others, seeing the exhaustion in their faces. These were good people, farmers, tradesmen, some young soldiers. But they weren't warriors. They were fighting out of desperation, out of the belief that something could still be saved. Thom had seen that belief in the eyes of every person he had ever led into battle, but it had never been enough on its own. It had to be backed by skill, by strength. Roderick, Thom said, turning to the young man. How much further? Roderick unrolled the map they had been carrying and studied it carefully. We're about halfway to Ashford, he said, pointing to the marker on the map. The roads get harder from here on out. We'll need to make a detour to avoid the main trade routes. The rebels are likely watching them. Thom nodded. He knew the terrain well. He had fought across it during his time as a member of the King's Guard. The land wasn't just rugged. It was treacherous, filled with hidden paths and secret routes that only those who had lived there for years knew how to navigate. Thom had a few tricks left up his sleeve, and it was time to put them to use. "Good," Thom said. "We'll follow the old path through the hills. It'll be slower, but safer." As they began to rest, Thom's mind wandered. He had not wanted to return to the life of a soldier, not after the years of war had left their scars on him. He had hoped for something quieter, something peaceful. But peace, it seemed, was something the kingdom had never truly known. It was always one battle away from collapse, one rebellion away from crumbling. The outlaws, the rebels, the factions, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, a kingdom torn apart by greed, betrayal, and ambition. Thom had been a part of that world once, and now he was being asked to return. But the choice wasn't his. It never really had been. He was no longer just an old bartender. He was a man with a purpose, with a responsibility that could not be ignored. The kingdom was teetering on the edge of ruin, and Thom had the skills to stop it. Whether he wanted to or not, he was the kingdom's last hope. He had been the king's guard. He had been a symbol of strength, of order. And now, it seemed, he was being called back to the very thing he had tried to leave behind. "Thom," Roderick's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's something you should see." Thom turned to Roderick, who was looking at the horizon, his face tense. Thom's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. His senses flared. Something was wrong. The rest of the group was gathering their things, preparing to move again. But Thom and Roderick exchanged a knowing glance. The sense of unease was palpable. Thom wasn't sure what it was, but he could feel it. The tension, the weight of something about to happen. "Stay close," Thom muttered, and the group immediately fell into formation, the quiet tension thick in the air. The old warrior in him was awake again, and he wasn't going to let his guard down. Not yet. They moved cautiously, but no danger came. The air was thick with the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. The trees stretched overhead, casting long shadows over the path, the sun flickering through the leaves. As they neared a narrow gorge between two hills, Thom stopped, raising a hand. "Something's not right," he murmured. Roderick, sensing it too, stepped forward. "You feel it, don't you?" Thom didn't answer. Instead, he scanned the hills, his eyes sharp, the years of training coming back in an instant. The moment he had dreaded was here. "We're not alone," Thom whispered. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the air. The trap had been set. The sharp whistle that had sliced through the air echoed in Thom's ears, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The forest, once calm and peaceful, now felt like a cage closing in around them. Thom's senses flared, every nerve in his body alert to the impending danger. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm, thick with the promise of violence. His hand went instinctively to the hilt of his sword, the grip familiar, comforting. Roderick, who had sensed the same unease, was already shifting, his hand moving toward the dagger at his belt. He looked at Thom, his expression taut with anxiety. "It's a trap," he whispered. "They're waiting for us." Thom's eyes darted around, scanning the tree line, the shadows beneath the towering pines, the rocky outcroppings ahead. It wasn't the first time he had been ambushed, but that didn't make the feeling any less sharp. "Stay alert," Thom muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "We have no choice but to move forward." The rest of the group, sensing the shift in atmosphere, had fallen silent. Thom could feel the weight of their fear. They weren't soldiers, not like him. They were villagers, people who had never known the sharp edge of a blade in battle. Thom's jaw clenched as he gave them a reassuring nod, though deep down, he knew this wasn't a battle they were prepared for. Thom led them forward, his pace deliberate, his eyes scanning the hills around them. Every step he took was measured, every muscle taut with the anticipation of the ambush that was sure to come. He had faced many enemies before, kings, rebels, and foreign invaders. But the bandits waiting in the hills felt different. They weren't just fighting for gold or land. They were fighting to protect the chaos they had created, and Thom could feel their desperation. The path ahead narrowed, winding between the high cliffs on either side. The trees had thinned here, leaving just enough space for a group of men to move silently. Thom's mind raced. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it. But he couldn't afford to turn back. If they retreated, they'd be cut down. No, they had to press forward, show their strength, and hope they could catch their attackers off guard. And then, without warning, the trap sprung. From the cliffs above, a rain of arrows came down, swift and deadly. Tom's instincts kicked in, and he pushed the nearest loyalists down behind a large boulder, using it as cover. The sharp twang of the bowstrings rang out, and several arrows thudded into the ground near them, one grazing Tom's arm. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and shouted to the others, "Get to cover! Move!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Roderick was already on his feet, his sword drawn, the fear in his eyes replaced by a fierce determination. "We need to fight back," he shouted. But Tom held up a hand, signaling for him to wait. "No," Tom said, his voice grim. "Not yet." He could feel the enemy above them now, moving silently on the ridges, trying to get into position. Their attacks would come in waves, first the arrows, then the close combat. Tom knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to force them into a corner, to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. But Tom wasn't going to fall for that. Not this time. "Hold your positions," Tom commanded. "We wait until they're close enough." The arrows stopped as suddenly as they had started, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Tom's senses were on high alert, every part of him expecting the worst. The bandits were closing in now, creeping down the hills, moving stealthily but with deadly intent. Then, with a grunt, the first outlaw emerged from the trees, charging toward them with a crude battle axe raised. Tom's sword was in his hand before the man had taken another step. He swung the blade in a smooth, practiced arc, cutting through the air and striking the outlaw in the chest with a clean, swift blow. The man fell, his axe clattering to the ground beside him. Roderick's eyes widened. That was fast. Tom didn't answer. His gaze was already on the next threat, his body moving like it was still in the prime of his youth, his reflexes sharp. Another bandit appeared, this one with a dagger drawn, aiming for Tom's side. Tom parried the attack effortlessly, his sword flashing in a blur as he struck the man's wrist, disarming him in one fluid motion. The bandit stumbled back, fear in his eyes now. "Move quickly," Tom said, turning to Roderick. "We have to press them before they regroup." The sound of footsteps and shouts filled the air as more bandits began to descend from the hills, their faces hidden beneath rough hoods and scarves. The loyalists, under Tom's command, began to fight back, but it was clear they were out of their depth. Tom moved through them, cutting down the bandits one by one, his sword a deadly dance of precision and power. He was no longer the tired old bartender. He was a soldier, a king's guard, and he was doing what he had been trained to do. The bandits, realizing they couldn't break Tom's defenses, tried to close the gap, to swarm him with sheer numbers. But Tom anticipated every move. He ducked, sidestepped, and slashed with ruthless efficiency, taking down one bandit after another. But despite his skill, he knew that they were still outnumbered. The fight was far from over. Just as Tom was about to strike down another attacker, a sharp pain shot through his side. A bandit had managed to get behind him, plunging a knife into his ribs. Tom grunted, his body instinctively shifting to counter the attack. His sword swept through the air, knocking the bandit back and sending the knife flying. Blood trickled from the wound, but Tom didn't have time to deal with it. He gritted his teeth, his determination growing stronger. "Fall back," Tom shouted to Roderick, his voice hoarse but commanding. "Get to the cover." Roderick, eyes wide with concern, was already moving, his sword cutting through another bandit before he followed Tom's command. The loyalists, though outmatched, rallied behind their leader. They weren't soldiers, but Tom's presence gave them courage. They fought with everything they had, even as the bandits closed in on all sides. Tom's mind raced as he led the charge toward the narrow path that would lead them to safety. The bandits were relentless, but Tom had one advantage. He knew the land better than they did. He had fought here before, long ago, and he knew every twist and turn. "We're almost there," Tom said, his breath labored. "Stay close. Don't stop until we're clear." With one final push, Tom and his group broke through the remaining bandits, making their way toward the hills beyond the clearing. The outlaws shouted after them, but Thom knew they couldn't afford to stay and fight any longer. They had won the first skirmish, but the war was far from over. Thom's legs burned with the effort as he pushed his way through the thick underbrush, leading the group toward the narrow pass he had once used to escape enemy forces in his younger days. Behind him, Roderick and the others struggled to keep pace, their breaths heavy and their faces strained with exhaustion. The sounds of the bandits' pursuit were still clear in the distance, their shouts and curses echoing through the trees. But Thom didn't slow his pace. They needed to get to the hidden cave at the end of the pass. It was an old escape route, forgotten by most, but Thom knew it well. It was a place of refuge he had used in his younger days, a place where he had hidden countless times after battles. It wasn't just a cave. It was a well-hidden stronghold, a place where they could regroup and plan their next move without being harassed by the bandits. The path was narrow, the rocks sharp and uneven, but Thom moved through it with ease, his years of experience showing. He heard Roderick's voice calling from behind him, urging the others to keep moving. Thom's heart tightened as he thought of the young man, who had become like a son to him over the years. Roderick was brave, no doubt, but this life, the life of constant threat and uncertainty, was not one he had been prepared for. Thom felt a pang of guilt. He had never wanted to drag anyone back into this world, but it seemed fate had other plans. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the mouth of the cave. Thom paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, his body aching from the wounds and the effort of the escape. His hand rested on the cold stone of the entrance, and he allowed himself a moment of respite. The bandits would have to search hard to find them now, but Thom knew they wouldn't give up easily. They'd regroup, they'd try to strike again. But for now, they were safe. He turned to face the group, his expression hardening as he spoke, and sighed. Quickly, "We don't have much time." Roderick nodded, already ushering the others into the cave. But Thom remained at the entrance for a moment longer, his senses alert. He could still hear the bandits in the distance, but they were getting farther away. For now, they had bought themselves some time. Once everyone was inside, Thom followed, taking one last look at the path behind them. The cave was small, but it had enough space to shelter them for a short while. It was cold, but the fire pit in the center of the room would provide warmth. He had never wanted to make use of it again, but circumstances had forced his hand. As they settled inside, Thom dropped his sword to the ground, its weight suddenly more apparent now that the adrenaline had begun to wear off. He wiped the sweat from his brow, but his mind was already racing. They had escaped the first wave of the bandits, but it wouldn't be long before they were back in force. Roderick moved to the fire pit, gathering a few dry logs from the corner of the cave to stoke the fire. As the flames flickered to life, Thom turned to face the others. They were all weary, their faces drawn and tired, but they were safe for the moment. "We'll need to rest here for a while," Thom said, his voice low, "but we can't afford to stay long. The bandits will regroup, and if they figure out where we've gone, they'll be back." One of the men, a stocky farmer named Tarl, wiped the dirt from his face and looked up at Thom, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "You said you were a soldier, a king's guard. You know how to fight, Thom. We need you. We can't keep running." Thom's eyes narrowed, his thoughts drifting back to his time as a member of the King's Guard. The battles he had fought, the bloodshed he had witnessed, it all felt so distant now, so foreign. He had walked away from that life because he had wanted peace. He had wanted to forget the horrors of war. But the truth was, the kingdom was crumbling. The rebels were gaining strength, the bandits were everywhere, and there was no peace to be found. "You're right," Thom said, his voice firm. "We can't keep running. But we also can't fight this battle on our own. I've led armies before, but that was a different time, a different world." Roderick, who had been silently observing Thom, stepped forward. His eyes were filled with a quiet intensity. "The world is still the same. The only thing that's changed is that people have forgotten what it means to fight for something bigger than themselves. We need you, Thom. The kingdom needs you." Thom's eyes met Roderick's, and for a moment, there was no need for words. He could see the fire in the young man's eyes, the hope that still clung to him despite everything. Thom had seen that hope before. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers ready to fight, to give their lives for a cause. It was a dangerous thing, that hope. It could lift you to great heights, but it could also crush you beneath the weight of its own expectations. "I can't lead an army anymore," Thom said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "Not the way I once did." Roderick shook his head. "You don't have to lead an army, but you can help us build one. We can unite the people. If we get the right men and women behind us, we can take the kingdom back." Thom turned away for a moment, his eyes drifting to the fire, the flames casting shadows on the cave walls. He had spent years running from that life, from the bloodshed, from the responsibility, from the burden of being the king's sword. But now, it seemed that life had found him again. He turned back to Roderick and the others. "If we do this, we do it right. No more half measures. We fight to win." Roderick's face lit up with a smile, and the others murmured in agreement. For the first time in days, Thom felt a flicker of something within him, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, but it was there. "Then let's make a plan," Thom said. "Tomorrow, we start gathering allies. We'll need food, weapons, and men. But we also need to understand the enemy. We need to know who we're fighting." Roderick nodded. "We'll get to work right away." As the fire crackled in the cave, Thom allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but for the first time in years, he felt a stirring of purpose deep within him. The kingdom had fallen, yes, but it wasn't beyond saving. Not yet, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers without a fight. The days that followed were a blur of movement. Thom, Roderick, and the others spent their time carefully planning their next steps. They couldn't afford to be reckless, not with the outlaws and rebels growing stronger by the day. They needed allies, men and women who had not yet been consumed by the rebellion, those who still believed in the kingdom, who could rally behind the old banner. Thom, though weary from the previous night's events, remained sharp. His sword was never far from his side, and his mind constantly churned with thoughts of what had been and what still could be. He was no longer just the bartender of Shining Chalice. He had returned to the man who had once been the kingdom's fiercest protector. The question now was whether or not the people would still follow him. Roderick worked tirelessly to spread word of Thom's return. He visited nearby villages, speaking to anyone who would listen, telling tales of the kingdom's once glorious past and how they could still rise from the ashes. But not everyone was eager to hear it. The rebellion had poisoned the minds of many. They no longer trusted in kings or armies. The wounds ran too deep. But there were whispers, too. Whispers of the king's guard, of Thom, the great swordsman who had protected the throne. Slowly, Thom began to sense a shift. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. The hope was fragile, but it was there. One evening, as the group huddled around the fire in their hidden cave, Thom leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concentration. They had gathered a few more supporters over the last few days, farmers, hunters, and traders, but it wasn't enough. They needed something more. "We need to head further north," Thom said, his voice steady, but tinged with an urgency that had begun to grow. "The loyalists in the northern towns, they've been untouched by the rebellion. If we can win their support, we can start to build something. But it won't be easy. They'll be watching for us." Roderick nodded, understanding the weight of Thom's words. "It's a risk, but we don't have a choice. If we can get the northern towns on our side, we might have a chance." Thom's eyes flickered with a mix of determination and wariness. "The rebellion is growing stronger every day. If we don't act fast, we'll be too late." The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Thom stood up, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword. His senses flared, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There was something in the air, something off. The horses weren't moving like they were part of their group. They were too fast, too quiet. Roderick, noticing the change in Thom's demeanor, stood as well, his hand reaching for his dagger. "We're not alone," Thom whispered, his voice low and commanding. A moment later, the sound of galloping hooves grew louder, and then, from the trees, a group of riders appeared. Thom's grip tightened on his sword as he stepped into the light, his eyes scanning the riders. They were not bandits, but they weren't exactly friendly either. "Hold your ground," Thom ordered, his voice calm but carrying a sense of authority. The riders slowed as they approached their leader, a tall man with a scarred face, staring down at Thom. His gaze was filled with suspicion, but there was something else in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps. "I've heard of you," the leader said, his voice rough, but not unfriendly. "Thom, the King's Guard, the old legend. They said you were dead or gone. But I see I was mistaken." Thom narrowed his eyes, assessing the man carefully. He had fought many battles in his time, but the face before him was unfamiliar. Still, there was something in the man's posture that spoke of experience, of someone who had lived through wars, who had seen enough to know when a fight wasn't worth starting. "I'm not a legend," Thom said evenly. "I'm a man who's been hiding from his past. But that past has a way of finding you." The leader studied Thom for a moment, then motioned for his men to dismount. "We're not here to start a fight," he said, his tone softening slightly. "We've heard the rumors, too, about the kingdom, about the rebellion, and about you." Thom's hand remained on his sword, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. You're welcome to sit by the fire," Thom said, his voice steady, but with a hint of caution. "But we don't have much to offer in terms of company. Not until we're sure about you." The leader nodded, seeming to accept Thom's terms. "Fair enough. But I think we can help each other." Thom raised an eyebrow. "Help each other?" he repeated. "You're a long way from home, and you're no friend of the rebellion. So what's your interest in a kingdom that's already falling apart?" The man glanced at his men, who were now gathered around the fire. Their faces were tired, worn from travel, but their eyes held a quiet determination. "We're loyalists, and we've been watching the kingdom crumble from the shadows. We've been biding our time, waiting for someone to rise and lead us again. Someone like you." Thom's chest tightened. He had feared this moment, feared the weight of the responsibility that came with it. The kingdom wasn't just broken. It was fractured, scattered across distant lands, and divided by factions that had long since stopped caring about the crown. And yet, here was this man, offering the one thing Thom didn't want: loyalty. The weight of it settled on Thom's shoulders like a storm cloud, heavy and unforgiving. He had run from this life for so long, had tried to bury the memories of the battles he had fought, the lives he had taken in the name of a king who no longer existed. But now, the reality was inescapable. There were people who still believed. There were people who still had hope. Thom turned to Roderick, who had been silent during the exchange. The younger man's eyes were filled with a quiet understanding. He had seen it too, the call of duty, the burden of leadership, the weight of what Thom had once been. Thom's voice was steady when he spoke again, though the words felt heavy in his chest. "What do you need?" The leader's face softened. "We need someone to lead us. We need someone who understands what it means to fight for a kingdom. And we need someone who can show the people that the fight isn't over." "You can do that, Thom. You can bring them back." Thom looked out over the fire, the flames casting long shadows on the ground. The flames flickered like the hopes of the people who had followed the old banners. And in that moment, Thom knew that the past couldn't be buried. It had been waiting for him, and now it was time to face it. "I'll lead," Thom said, his voice firm. "But we do this on our terms. The people need to see the truth. This kingdom was never just about a crown. It's about the land. It's about the people." The leader nodded. "We're with you, Thom. All of us." Thom took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The fire crackled in the silence of the night, the warm glow casting long shadows across the small group of loyalists gathered around it. Thom sat beside the flame, the flickering light playing across his weathered face. His mind was still racing from the conversation he had just had with the mysterious leader and his band of rebels. The weight of the decision was almost unbearable. For years, he had distanced himself from the warrior he had been, the swordsman who had once protected the kingdom. He had lived a quiet life, away from the politics and bloodshed. But now, he was being called back into the fray, not by a king, but by the people who still believed in the kingdom's future. Roderick sat across from him, his face filled with a quiet determination. The younger man had been with Thom through it all, and now, he stood ready to follow him again, into whatever danger lay ahead. Thom felt a pang of guilt at the thought. Roderick had already lost so much. He had fought battles Thom had hoped he would never have to fight. "We're moving out tomorrow," Thom said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady but heavy. "To Ashford. It's the largest of the northern towns that have stayed loyal. If we can win their support, we may have a chance." Roderick nodded. "And if we can't?" Thom glanced at him, his eyes darkening. "Then we move on. We don't stop. There are others who still remember the old ways, the kingdom before the rebellion. We will find them. But first, we need to secure Ashford." There was a long pause, the crackling of the fire filling the void between them. The other loyalists were either asleep or keeping watch, their faces tired but filled with purpose. They had followed Thom into this new life without hesitation, and for that, Thom was grateful. But the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and unprepared for the brutal reality of the war that was brewing. "The people of Ashford will need proof," Thom continued, his voice low. "They need to see that we are more than just a handful of farmers and traders. They need to see that we still have strength, that we can stand up to the rebels." Roderick's eyes flickered with understanding. "You're planning a demonstration, a show of force." Thom nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "A small skirmish. Nothing too major. But it has to be enough to convince them that we can win. If we can't even secure the town, then we don't have a chance." The sound of hooves broke the silence, pulling Thom from his thoughts. He stood up immediately, his hand going to his sword. Roderick followed suit, his eyes scanning the shadows of the forest. It wasn't unusual for travelers to pass through the woods at night, but in these uncertain times, it always paid to be cautious. A figure emerged from the trees, a man riding a tired horse. The man's cloak was dusted with the remnants of a long journey, and his face was obscured by a hood. But as he neared the fire, Thom recognized the gait of the horse, a familiar one. "Who goes there?" Thom called, his voice steady but commanding. The figure halted, raising a hand in peace. "It's me," the man said, his voice gruff but familiar. "Bernard." Thom's heart skipped a beat. Bernard was an old comrade from his days in the King's Guard, a man he had trusted with his life on more than one occasion. It had been years since Thom had seen him, and the sight of him now brought a rush of memories, of battles fought, of friends lost. "Bernard," Thom said, his voice filled with both relief and wariness. "What are you doing here?" The man dismounted, his face haggard and worn, his eyes shadowed with the burden of his journey. "I've been tracking the rebels," Bernard said, his voice low. "They've taken Ashford. The town's no longer loyal to the king. They've fallen under the sway of the rebellion." Thom's stomach tightened at the words. The rebellion had already taken Ashford. That was a blow he had not expected. He had hoped to find some semblance of support there, but now it seemed like they were fighting an uphill battle. "How many of them are there?" Thom asked, his mind already working through the possibilities. Bernard rubbed his face wearily. "Too many. They've taken the town's fortifications. The town's garrison is loyal to the rebels now. They've been building up forces for weeks, and they've got support from the southern factions. They're preparing for something big." Thom's gaze hardened as the weight of the news settled in. Ashford had been their first target, their first hope, and now, it seemed like the rebellion had already claimed it as their own. "We don't have time to waste," Thom said, his voice firm. "We'll need to change our plans. If Ashford's already lost, then we find a new path. We'll move toward the other towns, gather support. We can't let them think we're giving up." Bernard nodded grimly. "There's a group of loyalists in the town of Highridge. They're still holding out. If you want to keep the momentum going, that's where you need to go." Thom looked at Roderick, who had been silent through the exchange, and then back at the group of loyalists behind him. They were all looking at him now, waiting for him to decide. They needed direction, leadership, and Thom had always been the one to lead, even when he had tried to run from it. "Highridge it is," Thom said, his voice steady, though his heart ached with the weight of the decision. "We're not stopping. We'll get there. Rally those who are still loyal and keep moving. This rebellion won't take everything." Bernard, though tired, stood a little straighter. "You're right. There's still time. But you need to act fast. The rebels won't let this go." Thom nodded. I know. But we have one thing they don't. Purpose. The fire flickered once more, and Thom turned his back on it, the flickering shadows seeming to vanish into the night. The road ahead was uncertain, but Thom was certain of one thing. He wasn't running anymore. The following morning, Thom and the group of loyalists set out toward High Ridge. Their spirits weighted with the knowledge that their mission had just grown far more perilous. The air was crisp with the cool touch of autumn, but the path ahead was anything but peaceful. The loss of Ashford was a bitter blow, but it had only fueled Thom's resolve. There was no turning back now. The rebellion was spreading, and every town they passed could either be a step toward reclaiming the kingdom or the beginning of their end. Roderick walked beside Thom as they moved through the dense forest, his face set in a mask of determination. He had known the risks of this path when he joined Thom, but even so, the weight of the journey seemed heavier with each passing hour. Are you sure we're heading in the right direction? Roderick asked, glancing at Thom, his voice quiet but filled with concern. We don't know if High Ridge is still loyal. The rebels have been closing in on every town. Thom's eyes were fixed ahead, his gaze steady. High Ridge is our best chance. If we lose them too, we lose everything. They're one of the few remaining towns in the north that hasn't fallen to the rebellion. Roderick didn't reply immediately. He knew the truth in Thom's words. High Ridge wasn't just another town. It was a key point in the kingdom's northern defenses. If they could gain its support, it would give them the leverage they needed to build a force capable of standing against the rebels. As the day wore on, the dense forest began to thin, giving way to open fields and rolling hills. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The quiet was unsettling. The only sound the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Every so often, Thom would glance over his shoulder, his senses alert to the possibility of pursuit. But the roads were eerily empty, the world around them quiet, almost too quiet. The group rode in silence, each person lost in their thoughts, their eyes focused on the journey ahead. The faces of the loyalists were grim, but there was a quiet hope in their eyes, a hope that had been reignited by Thom's leadership. He was the last of the old guard, the only one left who could remind them of what the kingdom had been and what it still could be. As they reached the outskirts of High Ridge, Thom motioned for the group to halt. He dismounted from his horse, his eyes scanning the town that lay ahead. It was a small, fortified village nestled against the side of a mountain, its stone walls weathered but sturdy. The gates were closed, and there was no sign of movement. Thom's gut twisted. Something was wrong. Stay alert, Thom ordered, his voice low. We're not the only ones here. Roderick nodded, his hand drifting to the hilt of his sword. The rest of the loyalists followed suit, drawing their weapons with quiet efficiency. They had fought together before, but this time, it felt different. They weren't just facing bandits or outlaws, they were facing the rebellion, and the stakes were higher than ever. They approached the gates slowly, every step deliberate. The town walls rose before them like an ancient sentinel, its stones covered in moss and ivy, a reminder of a time long past. The gates remained closed, and Thom could see the faint outline of a figure standing watch from the top of the walls. Thom stepped forward, his voice carrying up to the watchman. We seek refuge in High Ridge. Open the gates. We are loyal to the kingdom. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Thom feared their message had fallen on deaf ears. But then, the figure on the wall moved, and a voice echoed down. State your name, the voice called. I am Thom, former captain of the King's Guard, Thom said, his tone carrying authority, but with a quiet edge of desperation. I seek your aid. The kingdom needs us. The rebellion is coming. There was another long pause before the sound of heavy chains rattling reached Thom's ears. Slowly, the gates began to creak open, and Thom stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The group moved with him, their eyes scanning the town ahead. The gates opened wide enough to allow them entry, but Thom remained cautious. He didn't trust anyone completely, not yet. The town of High Ridge had long been a symbol of loyalty to the crown, but he had seen too many towns fall to the rebellion without warning. As they entered the town, Thom's gaze swept over the streets. The buildings were mostly intact, though a few showed signs of neglect. The cobbled streets were empty, and the air felt thick with tension. The watchman who had opened the gates now stood at attention, his eyes never leaving Thom. "I am the captain of the guard here," the watchman said, his voice deep and wary. "We've heard of you, Thom. Your name carries weight, even now. But there's something you need to understand. Things have changed." Thom didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around, taking in the faces of the people who had gathered near the town square. There were no soldiers, no arms. There was no sign of a kingdom's defense. "We are not the rebels," the watchman continued, his tone steady but cautious. "We've stayed neutral. But if you think the people of this town are just going to follow you because of your old name, you're wrong. The rebellion has taken root here, just like everywhere else. You'll have to prove yourself." Thom took a slow breath, the weight of the situation settling over him. He had known this moment would come, the moment when words alone wouldn't be enough. He wasn't just asking for loyalty. He was asking for trust. And trust was something that had to be earned, especially now. "I don't expect you to follow me just because of my past," Thom said, his voice steady. "But I'm asking you to fight for the future. The rebellion is not just a group of bandits. It's a movement that threatens everything we've known. If we don't stand together, we will fall apart." The watchman hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the people who had gathered nearby. They were watching, waiting. Thom could feel the eyes on him, some hopeful, others skeptical. Finally, the watchman nodded. "You'll have a chance to prove it. But know this, Thom. If you lead us into battle, you better be prepared for the consequences." Thom nodded. "I am. We all are." And with that, the gates of High Ridge opened fully, and Thom stepped into the heart of the town. The next chapter of the kingdom's fight for survival had begun. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a reddish hue across the town of High Ridge as Thom and his loyalists were led deeper into the heart of the village. The watchman, now accompanied by a few other guards, led them down the narrow streets toward the town square. The buildings that flanked them were solid and weathered, many showing signs of neglect, their windows boarded up as if the town had been preparing for a storm that never came. Despite the somewhat somber appearance of the town, there was an underlying sense of anticipation in the air. The people of High Ridge had gathered, watching the newcomers with suspicion and curiosity. They stood silently, their faces a mixture of fear and hope, waiting for something, waiting for someone to lead them out of the darkness that had been creeping over the kingdom. Thom could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their expectations pressing against him. It was different from the battles he had fought in his past, different from the days when he had commanded armies. This was a fight for the heart of a kingdom, for the future of its people. And unlike before, he didn't have the strength of a king's army behind him. He had only the loyalty of a few, and the fragile hope that they could make a difference. The watchman, whose name Thom had yet to learn, stopped in front of the square, turning to face Thom with an air of quiet authority. "This is as far as we go," the man said. "The council will meet you here." Thom nodded, but there was a sinking feeling in his chest. He had known the road would be difficult, but this was a reminder that even in the places that had once been loyal, there was hesitation. And hesitation meant division. "Where's the council?" Thom asked. The watchman gestured toward a small building at the far end of the square. "Inside. They're waiting." Thom gave a short nod and walked toward the building, Roderick following close behind. As they approached the door, Thom's mind raced. He had been a king's guard, a protector of the crown, but that title was meaningless now. These people weren't looking for a king. They were looking for a leader, someone who could help them survive the storm that was already upon them. Inside the building, the council was gathered around a long table, their faces grim as they observed Thom's entrance. There were 5 of them, 2 women and 3 men, their clothes simple but well-maintained, signs of a town that had once been prosperous. Their eyes, however, told a different story: fear, uncertainty, and beneath it all, a longing for guidance. The room fell silent as Thom stepped forward. He had been in many such rooms before, but this time felt different. This time, the stakes were higher. These people weren't just here for a speech or promises. They needed to know one thing. Could Thom lead them to safety? "I'm Thom," he said, his voice steady but quiet. former captain of the King's Guard, and I'm here to ask for your support. The kingdom is falling apart. The rebellion is tearing us apart. But we don't have to stand by and let it happen. One of the council members, a tall woman with graying hair, spoke first. We've heard the rumors of the old guard, of the king's army. But you must understand, Thom, that we've been isolated here for years. We've kept our heads down, hoping the rebellion would pass us by. But now we're caught in the middle of it. If we openly side with you, we risk drawing the attention of the rebels. And we've seen what they're capable of. Thom could feel the tension in the room. He had expected this kind of reaction. Fear of the rebellion, fear of the consequences of standing up to them. The rebels had spread their influence far and wide, using force and manipulation to ensure that anyone who opposed them would suffer. But Thom knew that this was the exact moment when everything could change. You're already in danger, Thom said, his voice unwavering. The rebellion is already here. You're not safe by hiding. If you want to survive, we need to stand together. We need to fight, but we can't do it alone. I need your help. The council members exchanged glances, their faces drawn in thought. The room was thick with tension. Thom didn't expect them to agree right away, but he could see the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the hesitation. They were scared, but they weren't lost. They still had something worth fighting for. Finally, one of the men at the table, a middle-aged man with a rugged face, spoke. What exactly do you ask of us, Thom? We've never been soldiers. We can't go to war. Thom looked at him, his gaze intense. I'm not asking you to become soldiers. I'm asking you to be the backbone of the kingdom. We need resources, support, and most importantly, the will to fight. If we can secure the northern towns, we can begin to build an army. The people still believe in what this kingdom was. We just need to show them that it's worth fighting for. The council members sat in silence, their eyes never leaving Thom's face. Thom could feel the weight of their decision pressing on them. He knew this was more than just a question of loyalty. This was about survival. At last, the woman with the graying hair spoke again. Her voice was softer now, tinged with uncertainty but still filled with resolve. And what if we fail? What if the rebellion comes for us? Thom's expression hardened. Then we fight, and we don't stop until we win. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Thom wondered if they would back down, if they would choose to cower in the face of the enemy. But then the man who had spoken earlier, the one with the rugged face, stood up. We'll stand with you, Thom, he said, his voice firm. We don't have much, but we have our loyalty, and we have the will to fight. One by one, the others stood, their faces resolute. They weren't soldiers, but they had something more important. They had the courage to stand against the rebels and the belief that the kingdom could be saved. We're with you, the woman said, her voice strong now. What do we need to do? Thom's heart swelled with a quiet pride. This was the moment. They had made the choice. The kingdom had a chance. Gather the people, Thom said, his voice filled with quiet authority. We begin with the loyalists. We show them that we're not afraid. And we prepare for the battle ahead. The council members nodded, their faces hardening with newfound resolve. Thom could see it in their eyes now, the belief that they could still win. And with that belief, they were already halfway to victory. The night after the council meeting, Thom sat alone in the small room that had been given to him in Highridge's town hall. Outside, the winds howled through the narrow streets, the chill creeping into the bones of everyone who lived there. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, but it did little to quiet the turmoil in Thom's mind. The decision to fight had been made, but the road ahead was still fraught with uncertainty. He wasn't just leading a small band of loyalists anymore. He was leading a rebellion against not just the rebels, but the very idea of a kingdom that had once been powerful, now reduced to factions and outlaws. And Thom, despite his best efforts to deny it, was the one who had to rekindle the flame of hope. Roderick knocked on the door, his voice low and respectful. Thom, they're ready. Thom stood slowly, his joints aching from the long journey, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. I'm coming. The town square had gathered a small crowd by the time Thom and Roderick arrived, the faces filled with uncertainty but also a spark of something else, hope. The firelight flickered in their eyes, illuminating the weary expressions of the townspeople who had turned out to support Thom. These weren't soldiers or warriors. They were farmers, traders, people who had no experience in battle. But they had something that the rebellion didn't have. They had their homes, their land, and their belief in something greater than themselves. Thom stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. They were waiting for him to say something, to give them the spark that would ignite their courage. "This is the beginning," Thom said, his voice carrying through the cool night air. "We're not a ragtag group of villagers. We are the last bastion of hope for this kingdom. The rebels want to tear us apart, but we will not fall." The crowd was silent, but Thom could see the flicker of recognition in their eyes. These were the same people who had watched their kingdom fall apart, who had feared the rebels would overrun their town. And now, Thom was telling them that they didn't have to live in fear anymore. "We will fight," Thom continued, his voice growing stronger, "but we won't fight alone. We will fight for our homes, for our families, for our future. And when the rebellion comes to our doorstep, we will show them what it means to stand with the old guard." A murmur spread through the crowd, the unease beginning to lift. Thom saw a woman near the front, her hand trembling but resolute. She wasn't a soldier, and neither was the man beside her. But they were both ready to stand and fight, to defend the town that had once been their home. "We don't have much," Thom said, his eyes narrowing, "but we have our will. That's more than enough. The road ahead will be difficult. We'll face battles, and some of us may not make it. But we will fight, and we will win. Together." The crowd, now emboldened by Thom's words, began to stir. Roderick moved beside him, giving him a quiet nod of approval. Thom could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. They were no longer hiding. They had declared war, not on the rebellion, but on fear itself. The Loyalists began to gather their weapons. They weren't much, a few rusty swords, some old bows, and a handful of spears. But it didn't matter. Thom knew the real weapon they had wasn't steel. It was their determination. And that, Thom knew, could change everything. "Tomorrow, we march," Thom said, turning to Roderick. "We head to High Ridge's northern gates. We need to send a message. The rebellion thinks they've already won. Let's show them that they've underestimated us." Roderick nodded. They're not going to know what hit them. The following morning, the sky was overcast, the heavy clouds hanging like a blanket over the town. Thom, Roderick, and the Loyalists moved quickly, marching in formation toward the northern gates. Thom felt the weight of the people's trust on his shoulders. This wasn't just about reclaiming a kingdom. It was about rebuilding a society, about showing the rebels that they had not broken the will of the people. The journey was slow, but Thom's resolve remained unshaken. With every step, the Loyalists grew stronger, more confident in their leader. They weren't warriors, but they were determined to protect their homes, and that made them a formidable force. By midday, they reached the northern gates, which were guarded by a handful of men. Thom stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. The guards, seeing the size of the group, hesitated, but they didn't move. "What do you want, Thom?" one of the guards asked, his voice cautious but firm. "The rebellion has taken the southern towns. This fight is over. We've made our choice." Thom's eyes burned with quiet intensity. "Your choice was to cower under the rebellion's rule. Our choice is to stand, to fight for what's left. We've not given up, and neither should you." The guard's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword, but Thom was faster. With one swift motion, he drew his blade and pointed it at the guard, his eyes narrowing. "You will open this gate," Thom said, his voice a low growl, "or you will stand aside." For a long moment, the guard didn't move, his eyes locked on Thom's blade. Thom could feel the tension in the air, could hear the muffled sounds of the Loyalists behind him, waiting for a sign. The gate wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a test. If they couldn't break through here, they couldn't hope to take the rest of the kingdom. The guard's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword, but then, without warning, he stepped back, lowering his weapon. The other guards followed suit, exchanging nervous glances. Thom's eyes didn't waver. "We're coming through," he said, his voice hard. "And this time, we're not leaving until we've taken what's ours." As the gates slowly creaked open, the Loyalists filed through, stepping into the heart of High Ridge. The rebellion may have taken Ashford, but Thom and his people had just taken the first step toward reclaiming what was theirs. The town of High Ridge was a mixture of tension and anticipation, and Thom could feel it as he led the group through its narrow, winding streets. The walls that had once stood as a symbol of security now felt like a cage, an inescapable place for those too afraid to stand against the rebellion. But Thom knew that the people of High Ridge weren't broken yet. They had just forgotten how to fight. As they entered the town square, Thom saw the faces of the townsfolk peeking out from their doorways and windows. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Thom's presence, along with the group of loyalists who had come with him, was both a spark of hope and a source of fear. They weren't soldiers, and the rebels had made sure of that. High Ridge had been left to fend for itself, and now Thom was asking them to take the most difficult step, believing that the kingdom could rise again. Roderick walked beside Thom, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders as well. He had always believed in Thom's leadership, but there was something different in the air now. This wasn't just a fight for a town or a battle. It was the beginning of a rebellion against the rebellion. It was a fight for everything. "We're here now," Thom said, his voice low, but full of authority. "But the people need to see us as more than just a group of farmers and traders. They need to see strength. We need to show them that we have the power to fight back." Roderick nodded. "But how do we do that? We don't have an army, Thom. Just a handful of people who don't know the first thing about fighting." Thom glanced at the group of loyalists following behind them. They were not soldiers, but their eyes were filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time: determination. The fire that had once been in the hearts of the kingdom's soldiers was not completely gone. It was just buried, waiting to be reignited. "You're right," Thom said, his eyes narrowing as he looked around the square. "But the people here know what's at stake. They've lived through the rebellion. They know what it means to be oppressed. And now it's time for them to see that there's a way out." Thom turned to one of the men in the group, a former blacksmith named Jorlin. "Jorlin, gather the others. It's time to show the people what we're capable of." Jorlin nodded and moved to speak with the others. Thom's gaze shifted back to the townsfolk who had begun to emerge from their homes, hesitant but curious. Thom took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, and raised his voice. "We've come to High Ridge not to take, but to give," Thom said, his voice carrying through the square. "We've come to fight, not for a king, but for the kingdom. We will not bend to the rebellion. We will not let fear control us. And if you stand with us, we will show you that the rebellion can be defeated." There was a long silence. The people stood in the streets, their faces uncertain, unsure whether to believe in what Thom was saying. But then, one by one, they began to move, to come closer. They were drawn to Thom's presence, his calm authority, the same leadership he had once shown on the battlefield. They weren't just hearing words, they were feeling the weight of them, the truth of them. Thom stood still, waiting for the reaction. It wasn't the first time he had been in front of a crowd like this, but it was different now. These were the people who had lived in the shadow of the rebellion. They had seen the horrors that had befallen the kingdom, and now they were looking to Thom for something they hadn't had in a long time: hope. The crowd shifted as one of the older women in the town, her hands weathered from years of labor, stepped forward. She was thin, her face etched with the lines of time, but there was fire in her eyes. "We've lost everything to the rebellion," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "We've been waiting for someone to fight back. But can you really do it, Thom? Can you bring us back from this?" Thom met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Yes," he said, his voice resolute. "We can, and we will." At those words, a ripple passed through the crowd. The uncertainty began to lift, replaced by something new, a flicker of hope. They weren't just hearing a promise, they were seeing a man who had once fought for the kingdom. And now, he was asking them to fight with him. The town square had grown more crowded, and Thom could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The people of High Ridge were no longer standing in silence. They were talking, whispering among themselves, their eyes wide with the realization that Thom was offering them something they hadn't had in years: purpose. From the back of the crowd, a young man stepped forward. He was tall, his face lean and weathered, his clothes simple but well kept. He moved with the confidence of someone who had seen battle, who had lived through the rebellion's chaos. He looked Thom directly in the eyes. "I'm with you," the young man said. "We'll stand with you." And then, as if by some unspoken command, others began to speak. More voices joined in. "We'll fight with you, Thom. We'll stand and fight." Thom felt a surge of emotion, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the excitement of the moment. It was the realization that they could actually do this. They weren't just standing against the rebels. They were standing for something greater. They were standing for their homes, their families, their kingdom. "We'll need to prepare," Thom said, his voice steady. "Tomorrow, we'll begin training. We need to be ready. The rebellion won't just let us walk away. They'll come for us." The people nodded, their resolve solidifying. It wasn't going to be easy, and they knew it. But they also knew one thing. The rebellion had taken everything from them. And now, Thom was giving them a reason to fight. The first steps had been taken. High Ridge had joined the fight. The next few days in High Ridge were a whirlwind of activity. Thom had given the order, and the people of the town, farmers, merchants, artisans, and the young and the old, had answered. They gathered every morning in the town square, the familiar sounds of hammers, anvils, and saws replaced by the clang of makeshift weapons and the sharp commands of Thom and his small group of experienced loyalists. The town had once been a peaceful place, a place where people lived quiet, simple lives, untouched by the bloodshed of the outside world. But now, Thom had made them face a reality they hadn't wanted to confront. The rebellion wasn't a distant threat. It was knocking at their door. And if they wanted to survive, they would have to fight. The first task had been to organize. They couldn't afford to waste time. Thom knew they didn't have the luxury of waiting until they were fully prepared. But they had one advantage. The people of High Ridge had spirit. They had endured years of suffering, and now they were ready to take a stand. Thom stood at the edge of the town square, watching as the villagers practiced with their weapons. Some held rusty swords they had pulled from their basements. Others wielded farming tools or makeshift spears. They weren't soldiers, but they were determined. Thom could see it in their eyes. The same fire he had seen in soldiers before a battle. The same resolve that came from the belief that they had nothing left to lose. Roderick was beside him, offering instruction to a group of young men who had volunteered to be the first to learn the basics of combat. Thom knew that the town wasn't ready for a full-scale battle, but this would be their first test. If they could hold their ground, even for a short time, it would send a message to the rebels, and to themselves, that they were not weak. "Do you think they'll be ready?" Roderick asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Thom turned to look at him, his expression grim but hopeful. "They have no choice but to be ready. We have no time to train them the way soldiers are trained." "But they know what's at stake." Roderick nodded, but the doubt in his eyes was clear. He had seen Thom lead armies before, but this was different. These weren't seasoned warriors. They were people who had lived in the shadows for too long, people who had been forced to hide from the chaos that had consumed the kingdom. "I know," Roderick said, his gaze returning to the group, "but the rebellion won't give us that kind of time. We'll need to move quickly." Thom's eyes hardened. "I know. That's why we're training them now. Every day, every hour counts." They continued to watch as the villagers practiced. Some were awkward, their movements uncoordinated, but there was a fire in them. Thom knew that fire would make the difference. The kingdom had once been built on that very spirit, the desire to protect, to fight for something greater than oneself. And that spirit had not yet been extinguished. As the day wore on, Thom turned his attention to the weapons they had been able to gather. Most were crude and hastily made, but Thom had always believed that a weapon was only as good as the hand that wielded it. He moved among the villagers, offering advice here and there, correcting a stance, showing them how to hold a sword or a spear. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Thom called for a break. The people were exhausted, their bodies not used to the kind of strain that came with training, but Thom knew they would push through. They had no other choice. He stood in front of the group, his voice carrying over the tired bodies in the square. "This isn't about becoming soldiers overnight," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. This is about surviving. This is about protecting what we have left. The rebellion doesn't care who we are or what we've built here. They care only about power. But we don't have to give it to them. Not if we stand together." The people looked at him, their faces tired but filled with a quiet understanding. They were beginning to believe, to feel the weight of what was being asked of them. Tom's gaze flicked to Roderick, who stood behind the group, watching with quiet pride. Roderick had been a soldier before this, and though he was young, Tom knew he was capable of leading. He had been by Tom's side during some of the kingdom's bloodiest battles, and Tom had always trusted him. "We're not just fighting for a town," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. "We're fighting for the future. The rebellion wants to take that from us. But if we stand together, we'll show them that they can't." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Tom saw the shift. The villagers were no longer just listening. They were absorbing. They were ready to fight. The next few days were a blur of training and preparation. Tom and Roderick worked tirelessly, helping the villagers improve their combat skills as best as they could. They practiced every day, pushing their limits, learning to fight as a unit. They were far from perfect, but they were getting better. By the end of the week, Tom had managed to get a handful of the more experienced villagers into a loose formation. They weren't an army, but they were a force. And that was all they needed for now. They needed to make a statement. They needed to show the rebellion that High Ridge wasn't going to fall without a fight. One evening, after the training session had ended, Tom stood at the edge of the town square, staring out at the horizon. The winds had picked up again, the clouds darkening with the promise of another storm. He could feel the weight of what was coming. The rebellion was closer now, and Tom knew they would be tested soon. They wouldn't have much time. But for the first time in a long while, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The people of High Ridge had come together, and they were ready to fight. They weren't just fighting for a king or a throne. They were fighting for something far more important: the future. The air in High Ridge was thick with tension as the Loyalists gathered outside the town gates, ready to face whatever came next. Tom had pushed them hard over the past few days. They had trained with the urgency of men and women who understood that their survival depended on it. They weren't soldiers, but they had the will to fight, and that was all Tom could ask for. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a muted gray, the first chill of night creeping into the bones of those gathered. The once quiet streets of High Ridge were now filled with the hum of movement, of villagers and Loyalists preparing for battle. Tom stood at the edge of the town square, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. His mind was sharp, his body tense. He had led armies before, but this felt different. These weren't the disciplined ranks of the King's Guard. These were ordinary people, people who had been dragged into a war they never asked for. Roderick approached, his expression grim but resolute. "We're ready," he said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the gates. "The rebels won't be far behind." Tom nodded. "We don't have the numbers, but we have something more. We have the will to defend this town. We have the strength to stand." The group of Loyalists assembled behind Tom, their faces marked by a mixture of fear and determination. They held their weapons awkwardly, spears, swords, and farming tools. But they were ready. Tom had made sure of that. They weren't prepared to fight a full-scale battle, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to make a statement. They needed to show the rebellion that High Ridge wasn't an easy target, that it was a town worth fighting for. A shout came from one of the sentries posted on the wall. "They're coming." A small group, maybe a dozen riders. Tom's heart quickened, but he didn't let the nervous energy show. He turned to the group behind him. "Stay calm," he said. "We've trained for this. We hold the gates. We fight with everything we have." The Loyalists lined up in formation at the town's northern gates, their weapons ready, their faces set. Tom stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the distance, where he could just make out the shapes of riders approaching on horseback. He could see their movement now, their speed, and he knew this was their first test. The rebels were here. The sound of galloping hooves grew louder as the riders neared, their silhouettes now sharp against the dimming sky. Tom could see their numbers, a small group, just as the sentry had said, but they moved with purpose. It was a test, a probing attack to see if the town was truly willing to fight back. They think we're weak, Thom muttered under his breath, tightening his grip on his sword. Let's show them we're not. The rebels arrived in the clearing just outside the gates, their horses slowing as they circled the town. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scarred face, rode forward, his voice carrying over the distance. "Open the gates," he shouted. "We have no quarrel with you, Thom. Stand down, and we'll let you live. Resist, and we'll burn this town to the ground." Thom's grip tightened on his sword, and he stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "You won't be burning anything today." The rebels laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. The leader dismounted from his horse, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Thom. "You think you can fight us with a few farmers and traders? You're outnumbered, old man. Surrender now, and maybe we'll spare you." Thom's jaw clenched. He had faced threats like this before, but this time was different. The people of High Ridge were watching him. They were waiting for him to lead them, to show them that they could stand tall in the face of the rebellion. "You don't understand," Thom said, his voice cold. "This town is worth more than your threats. And it's not just the town you'll have to deal with. It's the spirit of its people." The rebel leader sneered, drawing his sword. "We'll see about that." In a flash, the rebel leader charged, his sword raised high. The sound of metal clashing rang out as Thom met the leader in the center of the clearing. Thom moved swiftly, his blade a blur, as he parried the leader's attack with a fluid motion. He could feel the rust on his own skills, but the instincts were still there. His body remembered the movements, the power in his strikes, the way his sword sang through the air. The rebel leader staggered back, surprised by the force of Thom's strike. Thom didn't hesitate. He pressed forward, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. The clash of steel rang out again as the leader raised his sword to block, but Thom's attack was too swift. With a well-placed strike, Thom knocked the rebel leader's sword from his hand, sending it flying to the ground. The leader backed away, fear flashing in his eyes for the first time. "You're stronger than I thought," he muttered, looking to his men for support. But Thom wasn't finished. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the people of High Ridge, for the kingdom. He stepped forward, his sword aimed at the leader's throat, his voice low and steady. "Leave. Now. This is your only warning." The rebel leader's eyes flickered with anger, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned to his men. "Retreat," he shouted. "We'll be back." Thom's eyes narrowed as the rebels mounted their horses and began to retreat into the distance. He knew this was only the beginning. The rebellion wouldn't just let them go. But for now, they had won. For now, they had made their stand. The gates of High Ridge had held. The first clash had ended in victory, but Thom knew the war was far from over. As the rebels disappeared into the distance, Thom turned to the people of High Ridge, his heart swelling with pride. They had stood their ground. They had fought for their homes. And in that moment, Thom knew that this rebellion was no longer just about reclaiming the kingdom. It was about reclaiming the soul of the people, about reminding them that they still had the strength to fight. "This is only the beginning," Thom said, his voice firm and resolute. "We've shown them that we won't go down without a fight. And now, we will take the fight to them." The people of High Ridge cheered, their voices rising in unison. The flame of resistance had been ignited, and Thom knew that it would burn brighter with every victory they won. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.